Wake up to Ara under the sun. Ara under the sun.
It was my first day in the field as a park ranger. My first duty station was in one of the most remote regions in the state. The sky over Montana hung heavy with storm clouds, casting darkness over the endless trees. The mountains lined the horizon, their peaks disappearing into the sky. I had never seen mountains so big, jagged, and imposing. I was eager to make a good impression, eager to prove that I belonged here. This job had always been my dream. But as I drove up the narrow dirt road to the ranger station, a knot of unease began to creep into my stomach. The isolation of this place was palpable, even from my car. The silence of the wilderness pressed in on me, broken only by the wind against the tree branches or the distant cry of an animal. Civilization was far away, and for the first time since taking this job, I realized how truly alone I was going to be. But despite this, I felt confident and excited to put my new training to use. The ranger station came into view, smoke from the chimney rising into the air. It was nestled at the edge of Pine Creek Forest. The station was small, squat, and unassuming. Honestly, more of a cabin than a headquarters. Standing by the entrance was Earl Bennett, a burly man in his mid-50s with graying hair poking out from under his hat, and a weather-beaten face that had clearly seen its share of harsh winters. He didn't smile when he saw me approaching, and he skipped the pleasantries. "You're late," he grunted, glancing at his watch. I swallowed hard, feeling my confidence suddenly turn into nervousness. "Sorry, sir, the roads." "The roads are always like that. It's the middle of nowhere, Montana, kid." He cut me off. "You'll learn soon enough. Out here, you better be prepared for anything." I nodded, feeling small under his stern gaze, like a child getting a good lecture from his parents. "Well, come on then," he said as he motioned for me to follow him into the station. As I entered, I spotted another ranger sitting quietly in the corner, staring out the window at the coming storm. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with long black hair tied back in a ponytail and a calm expression on his face. Earl didn't introduce him immediately. The station was simple. A few desks, a gun safe, a kitchen, a radio room, and sleeping quarters in the back. Earl handed me a map of the region. "Your job is to patrol this area. You're going to check for signs of poaching, illegal campsites, and anything else that doesn't belong. Poaching's been a problem around here for a while. Keep your eyes open, learn your area, and don't ever let yourself get too comfortable." I nodded, unfolding the map and scanning the area. My territory stretched deep into the dense forests, far beyond where most people would dare to venture. "And him?" I asked, motioning toward the man by the window. Earl glanced over. "That's Daniel Black Elk. He's the quiet type, but he knows these woods better than anyone. If he gives you guidance, you better listen up. His family's been on this land for generations." I extended my hand to Daniel. "Tom Carter, good to meet you, Daniel." Daniel's grip was firm but gentle, his eyes never leaving mine as we shook hands. "Daniel Black Elk," he said in a voice that was low and smooth. "Welcome to Pine Creek." Earl wasted no time getting down to business. He spread a map of the area across the table and tapped at it with his thick fingers. "This is your territory now. The Pine Creek region is thousands of acres of forest, mountain, rivers, and lakes. You'll be responsible for these areas, keeping an eye out for anything unusual." I nodded, trying to absorb the sheer scale of the territory. "Anything in particular that I should be looking for?" "Everything," Earl said flatly. "This ain't some well-maintained national park. It's rough terrain. Weather changes fast, animals aren't always friendly, and the nearest help is hours away. If you get in trouble out there, you're on your own, so don't get into trouble." His tone left no room for argument, and I nodded again. He wasn't exaggerating. The sheer remoteness of the place was beginning to sink in. "What about the poaching?" I asked. "Who's behind it?" Earl leaned back in his chair, a grim look on his face. "Oh, locals mostly. Some of them hunt for sport, some for money. Wolves, elk, bears, you name it. They know the forest better than most, and they don't take kindly to us rangers poking around their business." I frowned. "Sounds like it could get dangerous." "It can," Earl said, and then looked out the window, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "But there is worse out there than poachers." His words hung in the air like a fog, and for a moment a heavy silence settled over the room. Daniel glanced at Earl but said nothing. There was an unspoken tension between the two of them, something that I wasn't privy to yet. "Like what?" I asked, breaking the silence. Earl's eyes flicked back to me hard and cold. "Just keep your wits about you and don't go out there trying to be a hero and get yourself or anybody else hurt." The first week of patrols was uneventful, but the forest had a way of unsettling me even when nothing happened. The trees loomed tall and silent, their trunks dark and twisted, like ancient giants frozen in time. Every rustle of leaves or a snap of a twig set my nerves on edge, and I constantly found myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. I reminded myself that I would get used to it with time. Daniel accompanied me on a few of my first patrols, guiding me through the more difficult terrain. He rarely spoke unless it was necessary, but when he did, it was always to point out something that I would have otherwise missed, like animal tracks or a hole to avoid stepping in. His knowledge of the land was impressive, and though he was quiet, I appreciated his presence. There was something calming about him, like he was in tune with the land in a way that I couldn't yet comprehend. I felt safe with him. One afternoon while we were hiking through a particularly dense section of the forest, I asked more about him and what his story was. "My family's been here for centuries," Daniel said, his voice low. "Long before the park was established, before the settlers came. My people have always been the stewards of this land. We know its secrets." "Secrets?" I asked, curious. Daniel paused, looking out at the trees with a distant expression. "The land remembers. It has its own memory and its own spirits. There are more things out here than just man and animals." I felt a chill run down my spine at his words, but I wasn't sure if he was being serious or if it was just a part of his culture. Maybe he was just speaking metaphorically. Still, there was something about the way that he spoke, so matter-of-fact, that made me believe him. That evening after we had returned to the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow felt like it was something following me, and every gust of wind carried whispers to my ears. I had been on edge already, and the conversation with Daniel didn't help. Earl brushed off my concerns when I mentioned to him what Daniel had said about there being more in the forest than just man or animal. "Ah, that's just first week jitters," he said. "The forest can get under your skin if you let it. Just stick to your patrols and don't go looking for trouble." We all felt like that when we were new, and don't go listening to none of Daniel's superstitions. The guy knows his stuff, but he can get a little out there, if you know what I mean. I wanted to believe him, but the unease gnawed at me, a constant presence at the back of my mind. A few days later, I was out on patrol by myself, covering the western section of the forest. The day was overcast and the clouds hung low and heavy, casting everything in a dull gray light. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles, and the forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife absent. I vaguely recalled something in my training about when the forest goes silent. As I made my way through a clearing, I spotted something unusual near the edge of the tree line. At first, I thought it was just a pile of leaves or debris, but as I got closer, I realized it was the mangled remains of an animal. My heart sank as I knelt down to examine the scene. The animal, what looked like had been a deer, had been completely ripped apart, its flesh torn and shredded in a way that didn't seem natural. The bite marks were too large and jagged to be from any predator that I knew of in the area. I had seen wolf kills before, and this wasn't the same. It was savage and brutal, almost as if whatever had killed it had done so for sport rather than for food. The ground around the carcass was disturbed, the grass flattened and trampled as if there had been some kind of struggle. but what stood out to me the most were the tracks. They were large, far larger than any wolf or bear, and they were shaped different. The toes were elongated, almost claw-like, and they dug deep into the soil, leaving deep impressions. My stomach churned as I took a few steps back, my hand instinctively going to the radio on my belt. "Earl," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I found something. It looks like a poaching site maybe, but something's not right." "What do you mean, not right?" Earl's voice crackled over the radio. "The animal, it's been torn apart. And the tracks, I've never seen anything like them. They're freaking huge." There was a long pause on the other end, and when Earl finally spoke again, his voice was tense. "Where are you?" "I'm about a mile west of the old logging road near the clearing." "Head back to the station now." The urgency in his voice sent a jolt of adrenaline through me, and I didn't waste any time. As I turned to head back, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Something was moving between the trees, darting from trunk to trunk with a speed that made my heart skip a beat. I froze, my eyes scanning the dense forest, but whatever it was had already disappeared into the shadows. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my pulse pounding in my ears, but there was no further movement. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, a heavy weight pressing down on me as I made my way back to the station as fast as I could. When I had returned to the station, Earl was waiting for me at the door, his expression unreadable. "Show me the site," he said, grabbing his rifle from the rack by the door. I nodded and led him back into the forest, my nerves still on edge from the encounter. As we approached the clearing, I pointed out the carcass and the tracks, watching as Earl knelt down to examine them. He didn't say anything for a long time, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he stood up, a grim look on his face. "Could be a bear," he said, but I could tell even he didn't believe it. "Bears don't leave tracks like that," I said quietly. Earl shot me a sharp look, but before he could respond, Daniel pulled up to the side in his truck, his face as calm and unreadable as ever. Daniel examined the site for a moment, but Earl again said, "Grizzly, I think, by the looks of it." "That's no grizzly," Daniel said softly, his eyes locked on the tracks. "That's something else." Earl's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the two of them traded a look. There was something that they weren't telling me, something they both knew but were hesitant to say out loud. "Well, what is it then?" I asked impatiently, feeling a knot of dread forming in my stomach. Daniel glanced at me. "We should head back. It's getting dark." I wanted to press him for more information, but the tone in his voice left no room for argument. We made our way back to the station in silence, the weight of the unknown pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. That night, after Earl had gone to bed, I found myself sitting in the kitchen with Daniel. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the fire crackled softly in the fireplace. "What's really out there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering flames. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "You ever heard of a Wendigo?" I frowned. "A Wendigo, that's like an old Native American thing, right?" I asked. "It's an old legend, yes," Daniel said, his eyes never leaving the fire. "The spirit of the forest. Some say that it was once a man, a hunter who became lost in the wilderness and resorted to cannibalism to survive. But in doing so, he became something else, something cursed. The Wendigo is a creature of hunger, always starving, always hunting. It craves flesh, and once it tastes it, it becomes insatiable." I felt a chill crawl up my spine at his words, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "So you're saying that's what's out there?" Daniel finally looked at me, his expression serious. "I don't know, but there are stories. The Wendigos can mimic voices, lure people into the woods. It's fast, faster than anything natural. And once it sets its sight on you, it won't stop until it's fed." I swallowed hard, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. And if it finds you, Daniel's gaze was unwavering. You run, you don't stop, you don't look back, and you pray it loses interest. His words hung in the air like a dark omen, and as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from these shadows of the forest. The next morning, Earl ordered a full patrol of the area. He was visibly tense, though he tried to maintain his usual gruff demeanor. We split up. Earl took the north and I took the west, and Daniel headed east. As I made my way through the forest, the weight of Daniel's story pressed on me like a heavy stone, and I honestly began to rethink my career choice. The forest felt different today. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness that kept me on edge. Every step that I took seemed too loud, the crunch of twigs under my feet echoing through the trees. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of something rotten, something that made my stomach turn. I found myself constantly scanning the trees, searching for any sign of movement. My nerves were shot, every shadow a potential threat, every gust of wind a whisper of something sinister. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead like a canopy of twisted arms. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl so deep. It was faint, so faint that I almost thought that I had imagined it. My heart leapt into my throat and I stopped in my tracks, my hand going to the gun on my hip. I listened, straining to hear it again. For a long moment there was only silence, and then from somewhere behind me came the sound of something moving through the undergrowth. It sounded fast, impossibly fast. I spun around, my pulse racing, but there was nothing there, just the trees, silent. I took a step back, my hand tightening on my gun. The growl came again, this time louder, closer. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and I saw something moving between the trees. It was a shadow, long and gaunt, darting from trunk to trunk with a speed that made my stomach churn. I couldn't see it clearly, just flashes of pale skin, long limbs, and glowing eyes that burned with an unnatural light. The creature lunged with an inhuman grace, its body almost serpentine as it weaved between the trees. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the shadows. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought that I might have a heart attack. I stood frozen, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, my gun drawn but useless in my trembling hands. For a moment I considered calling out to Earl or Daniel, but something told me that making noise would only draw it closer. And then from deep in the forest, I heard my name. Tom. The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. It was Earl's voice calling to me from somewhere beyond the trees. For a moment I felt relieved. I had been found. My instincts screamed at me to run toward it, to get out of there. The voice, it sounded so real, so close. Tom, over here. I took a step forward, my mind racing, but then I paused. Earl shouldn't be this far into my section of the forest. He was supposed to be on the North Patrol, miles from here. But the voice, it sounded just like his. Tom. This time it was louder and more insistent. I took another step, my legs trembling beneath me. Something about the voice was wrong though. It sounded like Earl, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that sent a shiver down my spine. Suddenly, Daniel's voice echoed in my mind. It can mimic voices, lure people into the woods. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. It wasn't Earl, it couldn't be. Tom. The voice was closer now, but I didn't move. I couldn't move. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, and the forest around me seemed to close in, the trees towering over me. And then from behind me came a rustling sound, soft at first, but growing louder and closer. I didn't dare turn around. Every instinct in my body told me not to look, not to acknowledge whatever was behind me. But the rustling grew louder and I could feel something watching me, approaching me, something predatory. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Everything became silent. "Tom," it whispered, this time directly in my ear. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I just ran, my feet pounding the forest floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees blurred past me as I sprinted through the forest, branches whipping at my face, the wind roaring in my ears. I could hear it behind me, its footsteps impossibly fast, closing the distance with terrifying speed. My legs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Somehow I made it to the edge of the forest and I stumbled into the clearing. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. When I finally looked back, the thing was gone, but the feeling of being watched still remained. I felt as if I were prey if it had just been playing with its food. When I returned to the station, Earl and Daniel were waiting for me. Earl's face was pale, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by a quiet tension that had unnerved me. He looked worried. "What happened?" Earl asked, his voice tight. I told him everything, the growl, the creature, the voice. As I spoke, Daniel's expression grew darker, his eyes narrowing in thought. Earl, however, remained silent, his jaw clenched. When I finished, the room was filled with an oppressive silence. Finally, Daniel spoke. "You encountered it, the Wendigo," he said, his voice low. Earl shot him a sharp look. "Oh, don't start with that bullshit." "It's not bullshit," Daniel said, his tone firm. "You saw the tracks. You heard the voice yourself once too, Earl. You know what's out there. You've always known." I looked between them, confusion and fear swirling in my mind. "What's going on? What do you mean?" Earl let out a long, weary sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yeah, I heard a voice once too calling me," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "But it's just some old legend." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "And it's hunting me." Daniel nodded. "It's been here long before the park was established, long before any of us. It's a part of the land, it's tied to it, and once it sets its sights on you." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. The weight of his words was clear. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "So what do I do?" Earl and Daniel exchanged a long, tense look before Daniel finally spoke. "We'll stay in groups for a few days until we figure it out." The days that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia. Every patrol felt like a death sentence, every rustle of leaves or a snap of a twig sending my heart into overdrive. The Wendigo was out there watching and waiting, and I knew that it wouldn't stop until it had what it had wanted. Me. But I wasn't going to give it the chance. I wouldn't be caught off guard. One night after a tense day of patrolling, I sat down with Daniel by the fire. The wind howled outside, but inside the station it was quiet. "Have you seen it before yourself?" I asked, breaking the silence. Daniel didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire, his expression distant. Finally, he nodded. "Once, when I was younger, my father and I were out hunting. We thought that it was a bear at first, but when we saw it darting between the trees, well, we never spoke of it again." The fire crackled softly between us, the flames casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled, and somewhere in the distance, I could have sworn that I heard a low growl. I didn't sleep that night, and in the morning I knew one thing for certain. The Wendigo was still out there, and it wasn't done with me yet. The atmosphere in the ranger station had become stifling. My encounter with whatever was lurking in the woods, the Wendigo or whatever it was, loomed over us like a dark cloud. We patrolled together now, never venturing into the forest alone. Daniel insisted on this, but it was clear that tension between him and Earl was mounting with each passing day. Earl was a no-nonsense type, and all the talk about the Wendigo was getting to him. He masked it with tough talk and hard looks, but I could see through it. Daniel, on the other hand, was quiet, reflective, and unnervingly calm. It was the kind of calm that made me wonder if he had already made peace with the idea that things weren't going to end well. We still had a job to do though, and we couldn't just sit in the station. Outside though, the usual sounds of nature were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. Not even the wind seemed to move anymore. I often found myself glancing between the two men, feeling like I was caught in the middle of two fighting parents. One afternoon, after busting up a beaver dam, we were on our way back to the station when we came across another mutilated deer. "It's another one," Daniel said. Earl knelt beside the remnants, his face twisted in frustration. "We're chasing shadows out here," Earl muttered, standing up and wiping his hands on his pants. "This ain't no Wendigo, probably just some damn bear with a grudge." Daniel, standing a few feet away, was watching the tree line, his eyes scanning the distance as if waiting for something to emerge. When Earl's grumbling grew louder, Daniel finally spoke up. "You know that it's not a bear, Earl. You've seen the tracks." Earl shot him a sharp look. "I've been doing this for 30 years, Daniel. I know a bear when I see one. I don't need you filling the kid's head with your bullshit legends." Daniel's expression remained calm, but there was a hard edge in his voice when he responded. "This isn't about legends, it's about survival. The Wendigo is real and it's hunting us." Earl stepped closer to Daniel, his face contorted with anger. "You think I'm scared of some fairy tale? I've faced real predators, real threats. This thing, whatever it is, it doesn't scare me." Daniel didn't back down. "That's your problem, Earl. You're not scared enough." The tension between them was thick, and for a moment I thought that one of them might throw a punch. I stood there awkwardly silent, my eyes darting between the two of them, unsure of what to say. Finally, Earl snorted and stormed off toward the station. "I'm done with this shit," Earl muttered. "You two can sit around talking about monsters and fairy tales all you want. I'm going to bed." That night, Daniel and I stayed by the fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the floor. The silence that followed was suffocating, but eventually I broke it. "Do you really think that we're being hunted?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't answer right away. He poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers rise up the chimney before he finally responded. "Yes," he said softly. "I think the Wendigo has chosen us. Once it sets its sights on you, there's no going back. It's patient, it waits. It wears you down." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "And how do you stop it? I mean, how do you kill it?" Daniel's eyes shot up to meet mine, and for a moment he didn't say anything. And then he shook his head. "You don't." "There has to be a way," I pressed, desperation creeping into my voice. Daniel looked away, staring into the fire. "Legends say that there is, but it's dangerous. You'd have to trap it first, and that alone is nearly impossible." My pulse quickened. "Well, how do you trap it?" Daniel hesitated, as if debating whether or not to tell me. After a long pause, he sighed and leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The Wendigo fears fire. You would need to lure it into a trap with something that it wants. Flesh. And once it's close enough, you would have to burn it. But it won't be easy. It's smart, and it'll know what you're trying to do." A chill ran down my spine. "So we use ourselves as bait?" Daniel nodded grimly. "It'd be the only way." We spent the next few days preparing the trap. It was a plan born out of desperation, but it was all that we had. We set up in a narrow ravine deep in the forest, a place where the trees were thick and the ground uneven. We dug a deep pit and filled it with kindling, creating a makeshift pyre. The idea was simple. Lure the Wendigo into the hole, ignite the fire, and hope that it would be enough to kill it. Earl, despite his earlier protest, went along with the plan. His gruff exterior had been cracked, and I could see the fear in his eyes, though he had tried to hide it behind tough talk. He was desperate for it to be over. "Just make sure you don't screw this up, Tom," Earl muttered as we set the final touches on the trap. "We only get one shot at this." Daniel stood nearby, quiet as always, but there was a tension in him that I hadn't seen before. I knew that he was nervous even if he didn't show it. The sun began to set, casting darkness across the forest. The air grew colder and the wind picked up, carrying with it the familiar scent of decay that made my stomach churn. We took our positions. Daniel and I stood near the pit while Earl waited a little further back, his rifle at the ready just in case. For a long time there was nothing but silence. The forest was unnervingly still, as if holding its breath, and then from somewhere deep in the woods came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and not human. My heart raced as I gripped my gun, my eyes scanning the darkness. Daniel and I stood by the hole, waiting for our opportunity to light the fire. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then I saw it. The Wendigo. It moved between the trees with an unnatural grace, its long gaunt limbs twisted and pale. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light and its mouth hung open, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. The sight of it made my blood run cold. It was huge, much taller than I had imagined, with a skeletal frame that seemed barely held together by its rotting flesh. Its stench filled the air, a sickly sweet smell of decay and death. It moved toward us and we waited in anticipation as it drew closer and closer to the hole. Just a little bit further, I thought to myself. And for a moment I thought that our plan might actually work. But just as the Wendigo was almost on top of the hole, Earl raised his rifle. "Earl, no!" Daniel shouted. But before he could fire, the Wendigo moved. Fast, impossibly fast. It darted toward Earl, its long arms reaching out with terrifying speed. Earl screamed, a guttural, panicked sound, but it was too late. The Wendigo slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. Its claws tore into his flesh, ripping him apart with horrifying precision. Blood sprayed across the forest floor and Earl's screams were cut short as the creature's jaws closed around his throat, tearing it out in one swift motion. I froze, my body locked in place as I watched in horror. Earl's body convulsed for a moment before going still, his blood pooling beneath him. The Wendigo stood over him, his mouth smeared with blood, its glowing eyes locked onto me. "Run," Daniel shouted, grabbing my arm and yanking me away from the screen. We bolted, sprinting through the trees as fast as we could. The Wendigo let out a bone-chilling screech and I could hear it crashing through the growth behind us, its footsteps fast and relentless. We ran, the forest to blur around us. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't dare stop. The sound of the Wendigo's pursuit was right behind us, its screeches echoing through the trees. And then Daniel stumbled. I turned just in time to see him fall, his foot catching on a root. He hit the ground hard, and before I could reach him, the Wendigo was upon him. "Go, get to the station." I hesitated for a split second, but the sight of the Wendigo tearing into Daniel's flesh sent me into a blind panic. I turned and ran, Daniel's screams echoing in my ears as I sprinted through the forest. I burst through the door of the ranger station, slamming it shut behind me. My hands were trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood smeared across my face and clothes, not mine but Earl's and Daniel's. I stumbled to the radio, frantically calling for help. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Ranger Carter. We need immediate help at Pine Creek Forest. There's something out here, something killing us. Please send help." There was static for a moment and then a voice crackled through the speaker. "Copy that. Stay where you are. Help is on the way." I dropped the radio and collapsed onto the floor, my body shaking with fear and exhaustion. The fire in the hearth flickered weakly, casting shadows on the walls. The station felt too small, too vulnerable. The Wendigo was out there, somewhere in the darkness, and I could feel it, like a predator circling its prey. My body trembled as I stood in the middle of the room, trying to figure out what to do next. The fire cracked softly, offering little comfort. I grabbed the rifle from Earl's stash, my hands slick with sweat as I fumbled with the bullets. The radio sat on the desk, hissing with intermittent static. I had no idea how long it would take for help to arrive or if they would even believe my frantic call. My breath was shallow and my mind raced with images of Earl's body being ripped apart. Daniel's final screams as the Wendigo closed in on him. They were gone and I was alone. And then I heard it. At first, it was faint, a soft scratching like nails dragging across wood. It came from the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen, listening to the sound grow louder. My mind raced. The Wendigo was here. A voice suddenly broke the silence. It was faint but unmistakable. "Tom, let me in." I froze, my eyes wide with terror. The voice was familiar. It was Daniel. "Tom." The voice came again, pleading. "Please let me in. Help me. It's out here. I'm hurt. Let me in." I wanted to believe that it was him. God, I wanted to believe that he had somehow survived, but I knew the truth. Daniel was dead. I had seen it happen. And now the Wendigo was using his voice to lure me outside. Tears welled up in my eyes as I backed away from the door, clutching the rifle to my chest. "You're not Daniel," I whispered, my voice shaking. The scratching at the door stopped, replaced by a low growl. My blood turned to ice as I realized the Wendigo knew that I wasn't going to fall for its trick. Suddenly, there was a loud bang against the door, the force of it rattling the entire station. I stumbled backward and nearly tripping over a chair as the door cracked under the pressure. The creature was trying to get in. Bang! Another hit, harder this time. The door splintered slightly, the wood cracking beneath the force of the blow. "Tom," the voice came again, this time sounding like Earl. "Open the door, I need your help." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound. My hands shook so badly that I nearly dropped the rifle. "No, you're not real." Bang! The door buckled and I could see a long bony claw poke through the wood, scraping along the inside of the door frame. I aimed the rifle, my hands trembling so much that I could barely keep it steady. "Get away!" I shouted, my voice barely more than a whimper. The creature let out a low rumbling growl and then there was silence. The scratching stopped and for a moment I thought that it might have given up. But then from outside the window I heard it again. The voices. "Tom, come outside, it's safe now." "No, you're not real." The voices continued, calling me to come outside. I turned toward the window, my breath catching in my throat. The firelight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. My heart raced as I caught a glimpse of movement outside, something tall and thin between the trees. I backed away from the window, my stomach churning with dread. I knew the Wendigo was playing with me, taunting me, trying to break me down. It wanted me to open that door to step outside into the cold night where it could finish me. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life again. "Ranger Carter, hold tight. Help is inbound. ETA." The radio hissed with static, cutting off the rest of the message. But at least they were coming. I just had to survive until then. I grabbed what little ammunition that I could find and barricaded myself in the back room, blocking the door with a desk and anything else that I could move. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely load the rifle, and the constant scratching at the walls made it nearly impossible to focus. "Tom, come on kid, it's cold out here. Let me in." I clutched the rifle tighter, my back pressed against the wall as the temperature inside the cabin seemed to drop. The voices continued on for what felt like hours. My breath fogged in the air and I could feel the cold seeping in from the cracks in the windows. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the front of the station. The sound of splintering wood filled the air and I knew that it had finally broken through the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I heard the slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the station. They were heavy, each step causing the floorboards to creak under its weight. It was inside. I held my breath, my hands shaking as I gripped the rifle. My footsteps grew louder and closer. I could hear its breathing now, slow, ragged, and unnatural, like it was savoring the fear that it could sense in me. The creature was hunting me and it knew exactly where I was. Suddenly, there was silence. The footsteps stopped right outside the door to the back room. For a moment, I thought maybe that it hadn't seen me. Maybe it would leave, but then slowly the door began to creak, the makeshift barricade groaning under the pressure. I raised the rifle, aiming it at the door as it swung open, revealing the dark, hulking figure of the Wendigo. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, piercing through the dim light like two burning embers. Its mouth hung open, revealing its sharp, blood-stained teeth. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, and then the creature lunged. I fired the rifle, the deafening crack echoing through the small room. The bullet hit the Wendigo in the shoulder, but it barely flinched. It let out a bone-chilling screech, its long twisted arms reaching for me. I fired again, this time hitting it in the chest. The Wendigo staggered back, but it was still coming. I scrambled backward, trying to reload the rifle, but my hands were shaking so badly that I had dropped the bullets. The Wendigo lunged again, its claws swiping at me. I barely dodged in time, feeling the air whip past my face as its claws sliced through the wooden desk. I grabbed the rifle and swung it like a bat, smashing it against the creature's head. It let out another screech, staggering back toward the door. I used the brief moment of reprieve to grab more bullets and reload the rifle, my heart racing as the creature began to recover. Just as I had raised the rifle to fire again, I heard the faint sound of a helicopter in the distance. The Wendigo seemed to sense the approaching rescue as well, and it turned its head toward the window, its glowing eyes narrowing. The sound of the helicopter grew louder, and for the first time since the nightmare had begun, I felt a flicker of hope. The creature let out one final ear-piercing shriek before it turned and bolted out of the room, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. I collapsed to the floor, my entire body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. The cold air from the shattered door flooded into the cabin, but I didn't care. Within minutes, the helicopter had touched down outside the station, and several rangers and other state law enforcement officers rushed inside. They found me huddled in the back room, clutching the rifle to my chest, my eyes wide with shock. "Hey, are you okay?" one of them asked, kneeling beside me. I nodded, though I wasn't sure that I believed it myself. I was alive, but barely. The others, Earl and Daniel, they were gone. As they helped me to my feet and led me outside, I glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see the glowing eyes of the Wendigo watching me from the tree line. But there was nothing, just darkness. They transferred me to a new post near Billings, Montana, a far cry from the isolation of Pine Creek Forest. This area is more populated, filled with tourists and families enjoying the safety of a well-maintained national park. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to leave the horrors of Pine Creek behind. But the truth is, you never really escape something like that. The Wendigo may be far away now, but it still haunts me. Every rustle of leaves, every gust of wind that echoes through the trees sends a shiver down my spine. Some nights when I'm alone, I can still hear the voices of Daniel and Earl calling out to me from the dark. Sometimes I even swear that I see something moving between the trees, just out of sight. But I know better than to investigate or go looking for it. I do my best to not venture too deep into the wilderness. Once the Wendigo chooses you, it never really lets you go.